Start recording. All right. So, hi everyone, and thank you for being here today. I am Alessandra Saviotti, and I work as curator and educator, and I'm currently a PhD researcher at the Liverpool John Moores University School of Art and Design, and I'm also a long-term collaborator of the Association de Arte Útil. So I just would like to welcome everyone to this third panel discussion as part of the DPE, Decentralizing Political Economy Roaming Symposium, which is an event in collaboration with the Whitworth in Manchester, the City Lab at Liverpool John Moores University, and the Association de Arte Útil. So, of course, I'd like to welcome also our panelists who are with us here today. Bahar Noorizadeh, connecting, I guess, from London, and Art Catalyst Director Laura Clarke, who is connecting from Sheffield, I believe, and of course to Poppy Bowers, who is going to be the moderator of this panel today. Unfortunately, Kathrin Böhm cannot be here with us today because she had an emergency, so she is not going to be able to connect. So we are sorry about that, but she's fine. So before leaving the floor to Poppy, I'm just going to say a quick words about the symposium, and then, of course, it's going to be very quick, like 5 minutes, even less. But again, first, so to introduce the symposium, I'd like to go through some house rules. So we would like, while there is the conversation going on, if you could stay on mute, and then there is going to be a moment where you would be able to ask questions, so you can just unmute yourself, be visible, activating your camera, or just put your questions into the chat, and also use the reactions if you would like to send us a non-verbal feedback. So this, as I was saying at the beginning, is the fourth panel discussion. We had other 4 workshops over the month, and a very nice last workshop this morning together with the Alternative School of Economics and Marcus Coates, which was about the neoliberalism and the imagination. So it was really interesting to go through that experience and now have the possibility to discuss with our guests their practices. So we are going to record this panel discussion, as you might have noticed already from the Zoom voice. That is going to be also available later on DPE, like all the other panel discussions. We are doing so because the idea behind DPE tools is that it basically would become and function as a sort of collaborative syllabus or toolkit where we could always go back. And then Poppy, of course, she will explain a little bit how DPE works in the context also of the strand of research that the Whitworth is activating towards economics. So we discussed a lot of topics during the previous meetings that I won't mention here because otherwise I would take all the time. But I just want to mention that we could definitely experience a wide texture of practices across also different places and different experiences. So I'm quite looking forward to this discussion today because I think we are going to look at another selection of practices and institutions that are proposing to look at the economy in a new way. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Poppy Bowers, who is moderating the panel today, and thank you.
Hello, can everybody hear me? All right, good, that's good. So hi, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Poppy Bowers. I'm exhibitions curator at the Whitworth in Manchester, and yeah, I'll be moderating the discussion today. So one of the things that the DPE platform is doing is helping us shape up ideas and I guess inquiries towards an exhibition that will take place at the Whitworth in 2023, and that will be an exhibition on economics. And as I explained for those, I know some of you joined the session this morning, that very simply, as an entry point to that, what that exhibition is trying to do is reclaim our understanding of economy away from it as a central financialized system and towards the idea of economy as a much closer, more complex set of social relations of which we're all part. And therefore, as we'll begin to touch on today, we have the potential to rethink otherwise. So the title of this session, Reclaim the Economy as a Social Activity by the Means of Art, reflects on, I guess, the main thrust of DPE and the exhibition research, which is to look through economy at the ways art, its conditions and of production and circulation are being rethought in a way that enables art to go beyond being a mode of representation to operate as a tool of social, political and cultural change. And what I wanted to do today is think together on this shift and the role of infrastructure in doing this work. And we can think of infrastructure as being simply the connecting structures through which we organise. But more specifically, for some of the ways in which we work, it's the validated funding systems, it's the network of museums and galleries like the one in which I work, it's the protocols that surround the circulation of art within these spaces, the exhibition model itself, it's the institutions of education, it's the classification of certain sets of knowledges, it's the metric systems of valuation. So all of which structure our work in a particular way with the primary purpose of enabling efficiency and ensuring its our reproducibility and predictability. So in the text that I kind of like referred to for this session, I just quoted a short quote from Irit Rogoff's lecture on infrastructure that she gave almost 10 years ago now. But it's where she started to sort of question this, the role of infrastructure and thinking of it as a marker of sophisticated progress of professionalization that works to normalize what we do. And by doing that, it kind of suspends a level of criticality that we might have to how these infrastructures enable some forms of value to circulate and prevent other forms. So, some of the sort of opening questions or overarching questions, I guess, for me are how might we resist these dominant modes of organising? How might we occupy arts infrastructure in a different way? And how might we generate processes that don't tell us what we already know? So today, I'm really pleased to be joined by practitioners who are each working in different contexts to rethink and remodel our ideas of arts and economic infrastructure. We have Laura Clarke with us as the Artistic Director of Arts Catalyst, a contemporary arts organisation that supports artist research. And we have Bahar Noorizadeh, artist and founder of Weird Economies, an online platform that takes up the very complicated relationship of art and finance. So today's discussion will start with hearing from Laura and Bahar for about 10 minutes each to sort of welcome us into their worlds, and then we're going to move into a discussion prompted by a few questions that I've prepared, but I'm also hoping very much that we will all start to respond to some of the things that come up. I very much want it to feel like an open discussion. So I will keep checking the chat as we go if there's comments, but do raise your hand as we go. Okay, so I'm going to start by asking each of you to give us an insight into your work. And should we start with Laura?
Great, thank you, Poppy. So I'm going to share my screen because I think it always helps to understand what we do, not just by me talking or you reading words, but being able to see what we do. So bear with me, let me just get the PowerPoint ready. Okay, and then if I just do this. Okay. So as Poppy mentioned, I'm the Artistic Director at Arts Catalyst, and we're a visual arts organisation and a charity based in Sheffield. So just to give you a little bit of background information about the organisation before I talk through sort of where we're at the moment in rethinking some of the questions that Poppy was raising. The organisation was established in 1994 with a mission to explore the ways in which artistic research could enable a critical and an experimental engagement with science and the role of science in society. So that's really informed how we've developed as an organisation into being essentially a curatorial and research-led organisation. So what I mean by that is essentially that all of our work is informed by the spirit of inquiry. So we always begin projects with a set of key questions that emerge from a shared matter of concern. So alongside commissioning new artist projects and hosting research residencies, which is a sort of core part of the way that we work, we also do things like organising alternative schools, hosting lots of workshops, going on walks and hosting performances. We also host things like communal meals and reading groups, and we also produce publications and radio broadcasts. So the kind of manifestations of our work is very, very varied, but essentially they are different kinds of social activities that bring people together to enable conversations to start. That's sort of the kind of basic way that we think about our work. So over the past decade, we've sort of worked consistently within the crossovers between contemporary arts practice, environmental challenges, and health and economics, and looking at the intersections between these things. And we collaborate with artists and researchers from different disciplines, so the sciences, the humanities, from various environmental disciplines, as well as third sector organisations, academic institutions, local communities and interest groups to kind of collectively inquire into urgent social and environmental issues within the UK and beyond, but starting from the particular context that we're working within. And this kind of collective inquiry approach really shapes our long-term projects, which are sort of necessarily open-ended, and they can encompass many forms of activities, some of which I've mentioned, but really that's determined by the people involved in the unfolding nature of the process of collaboration and exchange. So this co-inquiry approach values all forms of knowledge equally, so the artistic, the specialist or the so-called expert, and the local or situated. And that really allows for a cooperative approach to exploring issues and sharing practices. So the intention of that is really to generate new knowledge through the process. And then where we're at the moment, over the next couple of years, we're embarking on a series of artist-led inquiries called Emergent Ecologies, and that will explore urgent questions around the future of cultural organisations and artistic research in the face of deepening social and environmental crises. So a key question for us as an organisation is how to embody our values beyond the programme that we produce. So how to really embed them within the operations and the infrastructure of the organisation. And also, I guess a key question is whether it's even possible to do this within a crumbling neoliberal economy that's based on a model which favours visually consumable impacts over essential infrastructural needs. So starting from the question of how to work symbiotically with and within a city, we intend to explore how Arts Catalyst as an organisation might operate in a distributed way as a kind of way to test out whether that might enable us to reconcile our programme with our operational model and our organisational infrastructure. So through the Emergent Ecologies programme, we will inhabit different places in South Yorkshire, including places like wetlands, city streets, wellbeing centres, community gardens, riverbanks and landfills, as a way to really think with the city and its various human and non-human residents. So this kind of co-thinking approach for us raises questions around who might the stakeholders of a distributed organisation be, and how might a distributed organisation be used by them, whether that's purposefully or incidentally. And what this kind of means in practical terms for us is investing energy and resources in how and also with whom we build and nurture relationships, and also being comfortable with the fact that a lot of this work might not be visible, or that what emerges from it might be less publicly consumable. So I think there's an interesting question there that maybe we can talk about later on today, is this question around the kind of economics of visibility. And what it means for artistic practices to maybe become less visible. And I guess also for us, it means acknowledging the importance of an invitation to begin a relationship, to start from a place of reciprocity and openness. So really through this process, each of the projects within the Emergent Ecologies programme will test out different ways of operating within a specific context in South Yorkshire to collectively explore a series of questions that we're starting from. So they're just on the screen at the moment, so I'll just read them out to you. What might a distributed economy for an arts organisation look like? What kinds of relations, exchanges and interactions might it consist of? What kinds of spatial, social and financial infrastructures might need to be mobilised? And can cultural or reputational capital be reframed through the value of the less visible or the unconsumable? So we're sort of at the very beginning of this process, so I don't necessarily have any answers to any of these questions, but very interested to explore them today, and we'll be kind of using them to guide the rest of the Emergent Ecologies programme. But really the intention for us over the next couple of years is to reconfigure ourselves as an organisation in ways that might affect or disrupt or transform the value systems and social relations that cultural organisations reproduce, and to kind of explore different ways of operating and inhabiting and coexisting in the city. So that's my sort of very brief run through of Arts Catalyst as an organisation and where our thinking is at the moment. And maybe it's also just useful to say, just kind of precipitating the question about infrastructure, is that we don't have a physical building. So that's something that maybe we can talk about later.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Laura. It's a really nice way to start. And actually some of those questions you brought up in that slide cross over with some of mine, so that's really good. And I guess just on a practical level, because I think the issue of scale is really interesting when we're having these conversations. So on a very practical level, what you've just mentioned, you don't have a physical building. Could you give us a sense of like how big your team is, how many kind of inquiries might be sort of activated and running at a particular time?
So in terms of scale, in a kind of corporate way of understanding the scale of the organisation, we'd be classed as a micro organisation. So there's just 5 members of staff, including myself, and we're all part-time. And then we have a board of trustees because we're legally constituted as a charity. So we have 8 trustees who, as charity trustees are, it's a voluntary role that requires their kind of governance to steer the sort of strategic direction and the future of the organisation. So I guess in a way we're sort of 12 people, but really the sort of day-to-day operations is the 5 of us.
Okay, yeah. And I think it's probably worth saying that you relocated to Sheffield from London a couple of years ago. Did you mention that?
No, I didn't actually. So maybe that also is worth saying, that that's part of the reason, well, one of the reasons for kind of embarking on this process, almost of sort of deep research into the South Yorkshire context specifically, is because the organisation up until 2020, although it was a process that took around 3 years of kind of relationship building behind the scenes, so part of that invisible work that I was talking about. In 2020 we relocated from London, so the organisation from 1994 up until 2020 was based in London, but also didn't have a physical building except for a 4-year period between 2016 and 2020. So as an organisation, it's kind of been in a process of ongoing evolution. in terms of how it operates, what the infrastructure is, what the resources are, what the model is. So it's this constant process of reinvention that I think, for me anyway, feels very exciting. And also there's a lot of possibilities. There are a lot of challenges, but there are also a lot of possibilities when you're a small organization to be able to just rethink things.
So lots of changes in the last few years, and obviously moving at a moment where there are huge global changes as well, with COVID-19 being the obvious huge change and huge uncertain set of conditions over the last couple of years. Okay, well, thanks so much. There's lots of things I think we'll start to pick out of that. I'm going to pass over to you, Bahar, to introduce your practice.
Thank you so much, Clarke, Alessandra, everyone. Thanks, Laura, for the great introduction to Arts Catalyst. So I'm an artist, writer, researcher. I'm currently doing a PhD at Goldsmith in the art department, the last year, basically. And my research for the past few years, so it's a practice-based work, but the research behind the practice for the past few years has been around this relationship between art and finance, which I'm gonna untangle a bit further. But originally, like these ideas were formed when, strangely enough, when I was in Beirut, like thinking around the economy of art itself, because it's a very kind of the art economy is an interesting economic prototype, because in a way it exemplifies a very perfect paradigm of the neoliberal market system. And by art, I mean like art in its very institutionalized form today, not alternative type of practices, but what's kind of like hegemonically called like contemporary art. And being in Beirut, I was exposed to this satellite effect of how cultural transition across the globe works. Like at least before the pandemic, maybe it's slightly shifted in different directions these days, but I guess like it's still pretty much like holds its previous model. So as an artist, I guess like becoming conscious of these economic infrastructures, you can somehow start thinking about subverting your conditions into like an experimental playground, like something that in which like your material and medium is the art economy itself. So I've been thinking about the economy of art the past few years as a medium of practice in a way. And this has always been at the basis of conceptual art tradition, of course, the question of value and labor. But maybe a shift that we've been witnessing in the past few decades is this turn to financialization. I'm kind of like using it loosely now as a turn because it's not really a turn, it's just the, the hegemonic turn of like financial markets and financial instruments since the 80s. But obviously these speculative markets and instruments, they pre-existed this era, but now we just see the exponential growth of these models in the past few decades. So then the question for me became how this question that how does art relate to this new turn, both in terms of the new financialized subjectivities, which is kind of based within the culture of finance and the culture of arts, and how living practices and life practices are shaped today, and the financial markets at large. So something that's key here, I guess, is art and finance as both reputational and credit-based regimes. So this is something that maybe like sets it apart from previous economic models and something that's mostly associated with neoliberalization. Basically, it's the question of how the role of image and representation in value generation is enhanced in this current paradigm. And I guess like this kind of like pings back to this question of visibility that maybe Laura just discussed. There is something within, you know, the kind of like value generation that's created around visibility and image that's much more kind of like present these days. And it's something that's, you know, the artistic field has a very strong holding in a way. So I guess to be an artist, it's really crucial for us to understand the terms of our participation in the financialized regime, as there's so much resonance and resemblance between how art and finance behave, both socioculturally and economically. And this is where I began with Weird Economies, which was my PhD research a few years ago, still in the making and thinking. So maybe this session is also some kind of a workshopping opportunity for myself, because there's so many like open-ended threads here. The kind of primary premise of the project, and I mean, based on what I was just kind of you know, introducing, is if we understand the speculative modality as something that's a shared space occupied by both art and finance, that's probably also where arts might have a leverage over the current financial regime. So if this space of speculation is something that both these fields occupy, like maybe that's where we can also start to effectuate the financial regime, and to retroactively multiply possibilities in the present by generating or augmenting different economic imaginaries, which I guess was a topic of discussion this morning too. So both art and finance, like in a way, like I want to like bring up this concept of retroperformativity. They materialize something in the present by these, you know, reverse procedures of bringing something from the future to make the present, you know, enriched with possibilities. So this shared space, like one of them is usually considered the bad guy, one of them is like the good guy. Like I guess there's, I want to figure out if, you know, if this moment of synergy like can have any potential. And I'm using like the word art here is like kind of rather loosely, because essentially any effort in expanding economic imagination is artistic in a way. So cross-disciplinarity is the principle that we follow in Weird Economies. So I'm just gonna share with you like some of the more like logistical or creative logistical components. This is our website. You can access it through this URL, weirdeconomies.com. So this is the front end of the public facing component of the project. It's mainly like at the moment, it looks pretty much like a programming space or a journal. And it includes like several components. We have, you know, contributions, primarily like research contributions by artists, which are in the contributions as you see here. And there are two other projects, the Glossary and the Fixes. So Glossary is an attempt to redefine or redetermine the glossary of finance from different practices. And the idea here is the financial lexicon is a social lexicon that's kind of like, you know, occupied by the financial language, but it actually could be used rather freely, coming from different approaches, more like, you know, sociopolitically informed approaches. So we ask people to, add their glossary definitions to a list of vocabulary that we provide, or if they want to provide a vocabulary themselves. And we have the fixes, which is a kind of short page-long, imaginative solutions. I mean, solutions is also kind of a crude word to discuss the complexities of the moment, but it's somewhat of an effort to just begin, playing and being playful with like what are the possibilities at least. And then the contributors in general are called stakeholders, and this is for now partly metaphorical, but the hope is that it wouldn't stay metaphorical, because ultimately the idea is how we can be self-reflective with the format of the platform itself. So everything that we're addressing in terms of content, we want to bring into the form of the project too. So we understand this project as a platform, and we want to reflect on the platform economy too. So we're trying to work towards how this space can be shared and co-owned by the contributors to the project itself, and that goes back to the back end of the project, which is this Discord channel or a thinking group where we hold workshops and assembly presentations. So lastly, I'm sorry if I'm running a bit over my time, but we are just holding a series of a study group starting in December, which I invite you to join. The registration link is on the website too. It's called the Cosmo Financial Study Group, and we have 4 or 5 sessions organized around reading of certain texts that are quite essential for the project. And I'm just going to give you a taste of what we're cooking, starting with this reading group, which is we're trying to address the question of whether from within the space of artistic practice, we can shift the waves of investments towards projects that are oriented around social and climate justice. And I use investment kind of rather both literally and socially, like how can we bring both financial and interest in investments into projects oriented around climate and social justice. And in a way, kind of, endorsing speculation as a methodology, I guess it means to use the techniques of finance to subvert and reverse finance's own tendencies that widens the accumulative effects of past injustice. So we want to be creative about what financial options we have within the space of art, and try to see like how these waves could be reoriented towards other means. And the reading group is just a start. I can get more in detail with the content in a bit, but I think I would just stop here for now.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. That's good.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I guess I'm just to follow on from that introduction about weird economies, just getting a sense of how that operates, because you initiated it as a website, and there's different contributions to the glossary. There's articles, and then there's these kind of I guess proposals, speculative proposals. And how do you bring people around that? How did you invite people? Is it open for a number of stakeholders to keep going, or is that the kind of closed group that's working behind this? Is that the core group?
So I guess I'm also kind of learning by practice through doing the project, but it's almost like a double strategy with how much of the activities are public and how much of the activities are private. I think this is something that Laura was also mentioning, with this politics of visibility, which, I mean, as the project kind of initiated, we started to understand, basically, sorry, before that, there is a core group that I organized immediately as the first step for the project. So there's a core advisory team of artists. You can find it on the About page of the website. And there's a team of, administrative team, which I'm also part of. I'm kind of like the chief organizer at the moment, but I'm working with a few people that help me with organizing the project. But besides that, I think I find both value in some of the public facing components, but I also feel like some of the conversations are usually more generative and you have them as a semi-closed group. For now, this is by invitation, but pretty much like anyone who gets in touch with us, like they can be added to the, to the core group. But the idea is, yeah, I guess like in a way it's interesting because you try to address all these questions of engagement and what does it mean to engage people with certain questions that are shared with all of us, but are rather abstracted because you don't have very clear kind of like, localized examples for them at the moment, but everyone comes from localized and rooted practices, so they can bring in, certain experiences to the group. But the idea of like, the platform as a connective tissue, it's interesting to think about like how can engagement happen here, and I guess that question of what money can't buy, because we are trying to have a very kind of fair and democratic economic system, but even through practice you learn how some forms of like voluntary involvement are for some reasons, usually like historically they've been more generative with certain types of projects versus when you do like economic based types of like engagement. So all of this kind of like goes into the experience of forming this thing, this group, I guess.
No, that's great, thank you. And I think, yeah, that idea between, maybe the expectation and the demand for visibility, certainly from my position working in a public art gallery, the expectation to sort of make public so much of the conversation, the research, and trying to balance that with actually trying to find the potential and the kind of richness of having more closed conversations. We're trying to work with both of those at the moment, but maybe we'll go into this. But yeah, so thank you. Yeah, I think that's a good brings up some questions around exactly the terms of transaction, the terms in which we come together around a particular question. So I guess I started this introduction, like, hanging it on this term infrastructure, which can be a bit slippery and it can have many different kind of guises. So I wondered if, you could both say a little bit, you've touched on it already slightly, Bahar, in your introduction, but how you are taking up this term and what in infrastructure you might be struggling with, or or what are you trying to work towards kind of remodeling, or I mean, actually, Laura, your question before was what infrastructures might need to be mobilized. I think that's quite a nice way of putting it. So I thought, should we have a start with that? And I understand also that there are no kind of clear answers necessarily, but it'd be good to get a sense of what are the kind of moments of tension or the struggles in which you're particularly bound up in at the moment with your work.
Do you want me to start, Poppy?
Yeah, please.
So I guess maybe it's useful to say, I guess, how we think about our infrastructure as an organisation at the moment. So I guess maybe, as I mentioned, what's not necessarily unusual, because there are plenty of arts organisations that are constituted in similar ways, you know, as charities, as national portfolio organisations that don't have buildings. But I guess that's a key distinction for us, especially in our new context of Sheffield, where the majority of other arts organisations in the city have very prominent public buildings or have very precarious public buildings. So that in itself is an interesting context to exist within as an organisation that has this kind of long history of working in a very sort of locally rooted way, but in different places. So projects that have taken place over the course of sort of 2 to 5 years in the history of the organisation, really building deep relationships in a particular place with people there. How to kind of transplant that into a single place is an interesting question that has informed the whole thinking around the Emergent Ecologies programme. So I guess the way that we think about Arts Catalyst's infrastructure at the moment is sort of what, in simple terms, what constitutes the organisation and enables us to operate at the moment. So I guess that would be our policies, the staff and trustees, also our financial resources, so the fundraising that we're able to apply for, the assets of the organisation, to use a kind of capitalist term, which at the moment for us, without a building, I guess if you're thinking about it in terms of material terms, our assets are an archive and some equipment in a storage unit in Sheffield at the moment, and our partners, and I guess our constituents or our audiences or our participants, or however you would want to think about naming the stakeholders of the organisation. I guess what I'm trying to say is that ultimately for us, everything, all the infrastructure that we think about for the organisation is underpinned by relationships, and also thinking of the organisation as a set of relationships held by people that constitute the organisation that goes beyond the staff team and the trustees. So in the way that we're thinking about the Emergent Ecologies programme, it's almost like this question of how do you reconstitute an infrastructure for an organisation that is based on a series of expanding relationships, and what does it mean to try to think about all of the other things that you ostensibly need as an organisation to be able to operate. What are the non-monetary ways of being able to do that through this kind of connectivity of relationships? And I guess that really relates to Bahar's Weird Economies as well, because it's a similar, in a way, a kind of similar way of thinking about what is, I guess, a horizontal or a decentralised or a socialist model for infrastructure for artistic activity. So that's kind of where we're sort of, I guess, trying to position the inquiry that underpins Emergent Ecologies, if that makes sense. But as you can see, I'm sort of thinking it through as I'm talking, because we're at the very, very beginning of the process. So it's going to be something that will evolve with all of the co-thinkers that we will build relationships with through this process.
Okay, I know we've touched on before, you know, because you're in, like you say, you're in a position of at the moment in a process of reinstituting in a way, or reorganizing Arts Catalyst and the framework and the modes in which it operates, and also Bahar with Weird Economies, and trying to think about where that will go to, how that sort of continues. It's with taking up these terms like stakeholder, like, you know, asset, staff, and, you know, these are really interesting. These are kind of there for us to kind of inhabit in a slightly different way. And so, I mean, when we talked about this before, we, in an earlier conversation, I was referring to a workshop that we'd done at the Whitworth with Kathrin and Cooper, who together formed the Centre for Plausible Economies, as a way of trying to think with staff at the gallery about trying to recognise what our economy was, what was the institution's economy,
once we started to try and map it out, we realized that terms like patron and volunteer, and when you sort of start to think about what actually is contributed and is generated through different people and individuals around the gallery, you realize that actually you could reorganize these terms. The volunteers are patrons, and so, but they're sort of categorized according to kind of financial kind of exchange in some way. So yeah, and I was interested in the way in which you take up the term stakeholders too with Weird Economies, and because what you're suggesting in that too is you're making that connection between the front and back of the kind of of the organization or of the project, the working conditions, the kind of what's at stake really for the artists involved in this platform. So yeah, Bahar, would you like to say anything more about how you take up the role of infrastructure?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting because I was thinking that like the key term for the project, maybe more than infrastructure, has been platform. This is like kind of like that object of inquiry, which, it addresses your questions, or what Laura was saying with the way Arts Catalyst is re-envisioning their own economic model. This is also something that we've been trying to think with the platform model itself, which is often taken for granted in the artistic field. I feel maybe, yeah, some of the conversations, like often you see in the art world, are a bit like, behind like, different kind of like, real world like manifestations of these forms of organization. But with the platform model, usually, we have these like mega platforms that kind of like substitute the function of Facebook in the art scene, but it's really like their governance model, their ownership model is not so much questioned, and despite the radical intentions or the thematics of the projects themselves. So this question of how the kind of this organizational model, which for now is also digital and online, although like we are thinking of an offline online kind of model ultimately, but this digital online space, like how can we rethink its governance model and its mode of ownership, which is really not, again, it's not, something very innovative when you step outside the artistic field. Like people have been dealing with these questions for like, millennia, but trying to like implement it in the art world, maybe, I mean, speaking of the challenges that you were mentioning, like what kind of challenges we face, I guess this is kind of like one of the key tension points, which is if you are speaking of a system that's fully atomized, fully individualized, how can you even begin to like think in terms of like collectivity with, other art workers, other artists? What does it take to, shift the conversation? And this is an experiment. Maybe I just like, yeah, I can continue later, but yeah, I would just like leave it at this question.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and actually I wanted to just touch on a kind of, I guess, a method of your research, which is to look back at sort of unrealized projects, so for example your film After Scarcity, that looks at cybernetic socialist planning, for example, and to sort of look back at projects like that and to think how we might be able to take some of that thinking, or how that might be able to help us frame our present moment and also project into the future. Could you say a bit about your film After Scarcity and that process of taking up these sort of contingent histories?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's a very good question, because that was the link between those investigations with the art economic models and weird economies. It's sort of like bridged that transition. But after, I mean, basically with the before after scarcity, with a friend of mine, we started this research group around called the protocol, the art protocol, which we basically are thinking about how you can regulate the global art field. A very ambitious, non-realistic idea. So it just remained as a thought project at the end. But it kind of triggered my thinking into, well, if you're thinking of scale, going back to the question of scale that you brought up, as something that has to be taken seriously post globalized markets, and the contemporary art field becomes like an exemplary of this this new shift, this new model. Then the question of like organization or regulation on that scale was something that I was interested in. So that was the point that I actually found this historical models of cybernetic planning and these ideas in the Soviet Union and Chile, like starting with the Soviet Revolution up till like 70s, 80s, where a number of cyberneticians, they basically came up with the idea of internet before the before internet became a thing in the US. So they're imagining a network of interconnected computers that would regulate, the scaled, like continent-wide, like national economy of the Soviet Union. And at that time, there are multiple models, like centralized, decentralized. It wasn't very clear, like, which direction it was going towards. But I mean, essentially, the way that people discuss it these days is like that would be what Amazon or Alibaba is today. But something in the service of like socialist, intentions and systems. So I made a film around that, which I called a sci-fi documentary, because I thought the imagination was very strong. So it kind of pushes you towards the future, but it's also very, archival and documentary-esque. Yeah.
Thank you. I realize that there's something kind of connecting, throughout, as you explained, Bahar, your kind of research has just sort of kind of continued and built and pursued down various kind of paths, and then, taken different forms. I guess you start with after scarcity, or that's one kind of manifestation of a set of ideas, and then weird economies is another. And I think one question that I have in our work and with DPE that we're thinking about is how you sustain a kind of you stay with a question, or you stay with a struggle or a problem, and when we're all kind of in this project based kind of economy in a way. And I was thinking about this with you, Laura, the way in which you work with different artists, and yeah, I guess some of the challenges around that. You have these research strands that you kind of you start from. So I just wondered if you could both say something about your kind of relationship, ties and building research and practices.
Sorry, Poppy, could you just repeat that last bit? I'm not sure whether it was my connection or yours, but you sort of glitched out.
I think it's probably mine. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it was really just to sort of if you can comment on how how you want to sort of how you try and stay with a certain set of questions, and how your research and the things that come from your research. So for example, Laura, you were saying about the new knowledges that are kind of generated through some of these collaborations and these inquiries. How do you hold on to that, or how does that you know, how do you stay with those? So it's a question of, I guess, when we're in a society that's pulling us to the next new thing or the next, you know, new interest, especially when we're working within a particular situation or within a particular location, a set of conditions, how do we resist the urge to kind of shift to a different kind of call for attention? How do we stay with the problem? Is that something that you feel is difficult to do? Is that something that is a strategy that you want to kind of deploy at Arts Catalyst, for example?
I think that's a really good question. And I think it always, like with everything, depends totally on the context. So, but I think ultimately the way that we have always worked and always want to work is in a very vertical way. And by that, I definitely do not mean a hierarchical way. I mean, in the sense of how we inquire into things, it's very much like a digging down and digging deep way of looking at things. So even though I guess the way that we talk about our work in the sense of how we would describe it in a funding application, for example, would be talking about how to connect local issues with kind of planetary scale issues if it relates to something like environmental challenges. But what that actually means in practice is essentially building all of the relationships from the very beginning to define what is that matter, that shared matter of concern that everybody, all the stakeholders involved in the project are interested in inquiring into. What is the key issue? And that is very messy as a process and can take a really long time and is invisible publicly, in the sense of, you know, when I look at the history of the test sites project that happened from 2017 and is culminating now in 2021, and that was situated along the River Calder in West Yorkshire, looking at the impact of flooding and water governance on the health and well-being of communities and ecosystems along the Calderdale catchment. And it brought together a huge number of individuals and groups with artists and researchers and the Canal and River Trust and local authorities, and essentially the whole process to get to the key questions, which ended up being around austerity and the impact of that in relation to water governance. That took over a year of having conversations, meeting people, just trying to find those ways to get to know people and understand what it is that they were struggling with, to be able to get to the point of having a core group of stakeholders that were invested in exploring each other's knowledges, perspectives and practices to be able to start. So there's this huge process that happens in this way of working before we even start more publicly articulating what it is that we're doing. So I think that in a way is really challenging in terms of, if I go back to mentioning funding, is what is, I guess, the, you know, all around the kind of philosophical way of that we think about our work and our practices. There's also the kind of practical reality of how do you make sure you're paying people involved in this process and paying people well. And I guess that is maybe a more boring conversation that we don't want to go into, I'm not sure, because it ends up just opening, you know, bigger questions around neoliberal funding infrastructures. But it does go back to something that I mentioned and Bahar has mentioned, which is this question around what holds financial value, what visibility, what are the visible things that are consumable and therefore hold financial value. So I guess, yeah, the underside of what we're doing through this programme is also figuring out as we go along, how do we keep fundraising for it to be able to allow it to continue when what's being produced publicly is maybe, you know, doesn't necessarily have that kind of the metrics of value that funders might expect in terms of, you know, audience numbers or, you know, meant like multiple activities happening constantly.
Yeah, thank you. That's it's something that was touched on a workshop we did with Owen Griffiths, actually, around this, the you know, the demand for slowness and the demand to understand the time that's needed to really kind of, you know, work through and with people around around a project or around, you know, a question or a problem that you know, he or the project is trying to kind of work through. Bahar, I wondered if you could add on to that. I know you have, for example, you have your finances transparent on your website. Anyone can look at your budget and see what's how much it's costed and where the money's been allocated. And you know, with that in mind, I know that, you know, this is this question of how this weird economies will continue and how it might take different formats. For example, you know, a real world physical format, for example, is something you're kind of working through at the moment. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, same as what Laura said, I also find this question very interesting, that like this matter of sustainability, or how do you actually stay with long-term projects? Because I think this is essentially really, Laura also mentioned that it's at the core of this financialized models at the moment, where there's this constant tension between branding in a way, as a way of like staying with an identity, and also the kind of like the need or like the push towards change, and you know, yeah, like the shift in brand. So it's like you have to have a brand, but you also have to be like, you know, flexible and mobile within your brand to survive like the funding system. So ultimately, it's about how you fund a long-term project or research, which is both required if you're working community rooted or grounded work, or anything that requires a historical approach, even like, you know, academic historical approach, which is interesting, I guess, in the institutional, you know, in the maybe art institutional model, like we see this shift towards like design studio or like residency, like very quick touch and go like residency formats in this way. So it's really the question of how can we bring back investments, and again, like I use it like in both terms, like literally and non-literally, towards long-term projects. How can you generate interest in, you know, in long-term projects? And I guess going back to what you said with like the funding model of weird economies itself, like I would say this is the one point that we have to be more experimental with this idea of where our money comes from. Like for now, we are getting arts, like very classical, conventional, like art funding from the Council for the Arts primarily. But it's the question of like, if these like, you know, if our monetary relations are actually interrelated, how can we fund ourselves by investing in other, you know, projects too? So can we find a model where our own, you know, sustainability generates like different forms of sustainability for other communities or projects that we are invested in also? And this is kind of like the key question. So we have to really start like, you know, reformulating our funding model in those terms.
Yeah, brilliant. I completely agree that I think that is a really fundamental question. I realized I should offer some, you know, yeah, the opportunity for questions from people who are listening in, or, you know, or any comments on what's been said so far. Anybody? Well, yeah, do just raise your hand if you're, or if you want us to unpack anything further. Oh, Alessandra, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have a question. I have more a comment because, of course, this is one of the last panel of the symposium. So there are a lot of words that are keep coming into the conversation and into my mind. So I was thinking something that was mentioned, I think a little bit from the three of you, this idea of visibility. And this idea of how visibility is linked to like a certain kind of consumption of an image or of the process, etc. And I was thinking what we were trying to do with DPE, which was a way to also make research public. So this idea also of having this kind of events that are more conversational or like reflection upon different practices, I think it's yeah, I mean, it's like in, let's say, in the economy of the project in itself, but I think it's a little bit like the idea that I have in mind, it's a little bit the opposite of consumption itself, because somehow it's also a way to stretch a bit the time of the event, of the time of research per se. So I was wondering if you have some thought about this, because I have these words buzzing into my mind, and somehow I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about visibility as well, because I guess when I was talking about that, I had quite a specific, I guess, frame of what visibility is valued. So it's interesting, you know, when it's something that is valued, I guess, in terms of, you know, funding models, is that kind of, you know, all of the things you would expect. So documentation of people smiling and having a great time participating in an activity, or you know, an artwork that has received thousands and thousands of visitors. So there's this, that's the kind of understanding of visibility that has a kind of value system attached to it. So then there's this interesting question of, when you make things, when you make research and work in progress visible, and you hold things that are public or semi-public or semi-private, there's a slipperiness there in terms of sometimes those things still have, they still circulate within the same value system through the documentation of them, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they feed into something else. And then I guess there's this question of, you know, for example, with the DPE research process, I wonder, would that be valued in the same way? You know, if you weren't kind of creating those tools, it's an interesting thing to think about, because that then becomes a product. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, when you make research processes public, if there's some kind of way of consuming them, then it circulates within that value system. But what if you don't? And then also, is it even useful if you don't? They're just sort of open questions.
Thank you. John, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, a really interesting conversation, but I think to kind of quickly add to it, and hopefully in a good way complexify it more, I think one of the reasons of doing DPE, the whole idea of decentralizing political economies, which took a big nod from Project Cybersyn, by the way, Bahar, and MedTV actually, was not simply to make research public, but to begin to find ways that constituent research could be made possible. When we were undertaking the L'Internazionale project Uses of Art, one of the reasons why we developed the constituent research strand, which I led, was everybody agreed that change was necessary. Everybody was totally on board with the project. The two problems were, how to do it, and how to jailbreak the top-down hierarchies of institutionalism, big and small. One of the first object studies we looked at was the Reina Sofia, who were doing just incredible stuff with a whole diverse set of communities and making research public, etc. And and the Reina Sofia is a behemoth of an institution, and they were completely open about the fact that whilst they were doing all of this stuff with people, it was still one-way broadcast because it wasn't altering the infrastructures of the institution at all. So I think the idea of having a process of research which is available and toolkits, it's not necessarily just to make that research public or to make that research public and longitudinal, as Alessandra's saying, which is crucial to try and defeat those kind of breakdowns of the way museums and galleries operate on a project-to-project basis, which stops the production of an excess value. You can't think longitudinally, you just do lots of work and it just becomes archival material for spectacle. But it's also, most importantly of all, to try and find toolkits which will enable people to also form ground up activisms that will eventually concatenate into constituent possibilities of doing things differently and melting and rethinking those infrastructures is something that the whole process, I use the term negotiating jeopardy, because there is jeopardy there. It's not simply handing the public the keys and saying the game's over, the institutions are bad, or saying institutions are great, we need to remain the same because they're the last bastion against neoliberalism. They're not. It's how can we negotiate those relationships, I think, and that's one of the things that we're certainly not going to solve it, but trying to contribute towards in DPE. And the reason why I made that interjection is as Alessandra was saying, the conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks are fantastic, and the kind of the scale and scope of the job is becoming kind of clearer in terms, and I'm really valuing what you're all saying this afternoon in terms of those processes. But I think it's key to remember that it's not making research public, it's making potentially research participatory that will change the system. How we do that's the difficulty.
Thanks, John. And we've had a couple of comments in the chat, and there's a particular sort of question or here from Danny, and I'm going to read it out. So it said, thanks for your fascinating talk. At the moment, I'm thinking a lot about the shift from neoliberal scarcity and abundance continuum that we are currently trying to negotiate in the arts to the future scarcity reality to come. I wonder if either of you are thinking about that in relation to platforms or programming, respectively. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. Or if anybody has across the chat, actually, because I know there's a lot of people here that we're all working in this, we're all implicated in this, so it'd be great to hear across the board.
I was just going to say that I think it's a really important question that I definitely would need to think about before even attempting to start answering.
I wonder if Danny, who posed the question, I don't know if you're there, but I don't know if you want to say a little bit about your thinking around it. Don't know if she's there. Danny was in this morning's workshop on neoliberalism and the imagination, and we did touch a little bit on this. But
you outed me.
It's okay. It's that time of day, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, thank you all. As Poppy mentioned, I was part of a really sort of generative workshop this morning around neoliberalism and the imagination. And I had a question there that we didn't have time to think about, and I wanted to carry it over to ask Bahar and Laura, who, thank you for your talks. But I suppose to to answer my own question about scarcity and abundance. So I'm doing a project where I'm thinking about just transition and how to use a gallery space as an experimental platform for thinking about just transition over a sort of a year-long period of time. And as part of that, I'm educating myself or trying to learn more about degrowth practices, decolonial and degrowth practices in depth. And, you know, something that kind of strikes me is, you know, there's been this real, I kind of grown up across a number of countries thinking about, and through that have always thought about scarcity, right? And talk about lack. And I feel that there's such a lack, as a sort of freelance curator, I feel that there's such a scarcity within the public UK arts system. All the artists that I work with are constantly under pressure and in these kind of difficult situations as well. So there's this hardship, but I'm also thinking a lot about how degrowth is not necessarily another form of democracy. Actually, it enforces upon us like to live within your means, and that doesn't leave us many different ways of being, right? So for me, I'm kind of trying to play with these ideas of types of scarcity, types of abundance. I think from a privileged point of view, I can say, yes, let's just be part of community. And that's a different type of value system. But, you know, that doesn't, I feel that quickly can be undone, you know, from these spaces. So I don't really have an answer, I'm sorry. I just babble.
No, it's good to share problems and things we're kind of like grappling with. I don't know, does anyone have anything to respond back to that, or is sort of thinking along the same lines?
I mean, it's really like the question. So I don't have very clear. Yeah, I think it requires so much like thinking. But I'm happy if like somebody else wants to join in also.
I mean, maybe, you know, thinking about this morning session, and I know not everybody was there, but I mean, it was a question about how we engage our imagination, and the, you know, thinking together about how we're always engaging our imagination, you know, subconsciously. And Marcus Coates, who was the artist that led that part of the session, was sort of talking about this constant functionality that the imagination has, in the way in which we empathize, the way in which we remember, the way in which we predict. And thinking about, I guess maybe it'd be nice to sort of finish around this idea of the potential of the imagination in trying to think how, or rethink the infrastructures that we want to kind of work within. I wondered if there's anything there to unpick just before we leave. And Bahar, I hate to sort of put on you again, but I know, because it's such a big part of your work, and it's sort of where it kind of begins to shift the conversation we've been having into a much more speculative realm, which I think is really important. And yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about how that's been a kind of interesting kind of point for you, or kind of, you know, area for you to look at your role of the imagination, and maybe particularly like fiction, the idea of fictioning, or.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is with imagination, it's also part of it is that it's a bit of a risky, like, you know, dangerous grounds, because it's like untested ideas that, you know, still hasn't gained like so much popularity. So it's like when you start like imagining, like for a while, probably you keep it to yourself. So I'm basically, I mean, I would just like very broadly like talk about what I'm sort of trying to move towards with Weird Economies, or we're trying to move towards with Weird Economies, which I kind of like touched on at the end of that 10 minutes. But it's this idea of, I mean, it relates to different models of funding too. It's this idea of how can we instead of going against the financial system, to incorporate financial system in a different way. Basically, I mean, I'm pulling from, you know, different practical models and like theoretical maybe models of thinking about these this kind of like financial incorporation, like through, you know, different actors. But basically, I mean, at the basis of all of this is that, you know, we are, you know, at least within like the Western, you know, models of economies and like elsewhere, we've been living in the financial time, you know, for a long time, and maybe there's also a kind of like danger of like trying to essentialize forms of value, which is usually like inbuilt into the, you know, language of like the constant language of regulation and, you know, different forms of like, you know, bureaucratic frameworks that are not that generative so much for us. And maybe like one way of thinking about it, especially through art, is to take speculation seriously and think about how we can actually collectively risk together, or, you know, decentralized valuation models in a speculative forward way, rather than, you know, trying to repress like the processes of speculation. So this is something that's, I mean, more the kind of concretely I'm thinking about what kinds of like financial investments can we make that, you know, benefits, you know, more of the projects that we are interested in, rather than, you know, kind of constantly evading money in a way. Like, are there like more interesting ways of like, you know, engaging with money? This is kind of like, you know, the question, because like we constantly bite the hand that feeds us, and especially in the critical format of the art form, and that kind of seems like it leads to nowhere at this point. So this is the kind of like the controversial grounds that I'm trying to like slowly like navigate in, but yeah, it's also very kind of like sensitive, and it has to be like addressed in a much more like sensitive way, I guess.
I think maybe there's an interesting question there as well around, I guess, the how to separate financial investment from what you're then investing it into. Because if you're going through kind of typical arts and cultural funding streams like trusts and foundations or Arts Council, any funding you receive is attached to a very specific set of conditions that also has limitations, not just in terms of how you kind of allocate those funds and to whom and to what, but also, you know, what you're able to say or not say to a certain extent through the work that you're doing. So I think it's interesting, this question, Bahar, that you are working through with Weird Economies. It's like how to kind of separate the two things so they almost run as like two parallel economies rather than one directly feeding into the other, that complicates the autonomy of the projects.
Yeah, thank you. Well, maybe that's a good place to kind of end. I don't know if anyone has any final comments. If not, then yeah, let's end it there. Oh, we've got one. So from Danny Child, who says it's interesting that the administrative systems of these funding streams often alienate those applying. Absolutely. And I think it sort of comes back to that question of like, well, what alternative financial economies might we be able to actually generate? Or, you know, it goes back to this idea of, you know, we're kind of work, especially within the arts, within a certain set of funding networks that we're all going to and that we're reporting to. But, you know, there's so much to, you know, you can sort of jailbreak your way out of that and start to think about how you might run your financial economy of an institution, you know, on a completely different model. But it does mean kind of rethinking, as you said, ideas of value, ideas of stakeholders, and rethinking what your financial budgets are and who they're serving. I'm just going to, Danny Charles just put her hand up, so please do chip in.
Hi, sorry, just to kind of elaborate on that point, the reason that I'm making it is because we're just concluding a research project on the impacts of COVID-19 on the creative industries in the UK, and I've been looking at museums and galleries in the northwest and northeast of England as part of that. And one of the things that's constantly come up in the interviews is how the funding applications for emergency funding during the pandemic, the arts funding available, has just been so difficult for people to complete. And it just seems that that kind of economic structure that's in place to support the arts is so alienating, to the point where people didn't apply, they gave up, or they formed networks of support, informal networks of support, and people helped each other out. And people, I've just come off the back of like a 2-day conference, and some people in the performing arts were saying how people from working class backgrounds just didn't know how to complete the forms. They hadn't had the kind of the training or the experience that people who come from kind of academic backgrounds had. And just this whole like system of how to get the money to do the thing that you're good at and that you want to do anyway seems really just alienating, I think is the word. Sorry if I've not put that very eloquently. I'm feeling quite exhausted after 2 days of conference. But I think it's important to know where the money's coming from and how you apply for that. Doesn't, like, it's not gelling with the people who are being funded as well. So I think these conversations around alternative economic structures and just doing things differently are really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Danny, are you giving sort of a talk about that report, are you? Has that happened or is that coming up?
So we've just done, the report is coming out in January. So we've just concluded the conference, but I didn't speak at it. Harry, my co-researcher, presented, but our stuff was in a panel on the digital, but Harry and I are working some more stuff up as well. But the report's coming out in January. Okay. But the project covers a lot of different kind of creative industries as well in the UK, so it's quite a full picture of what kind of happened over the last 15-18 months, but I can let you know when that's out.
Yeah, that would be great, thank you. And just so everyone can keep an eye on it who's interested. And I know Kathrin, who has managed to join us and listen in, has so hi Kathrin, and has mentioned about the art co-op who there you are, I don't know where you are, but they're a great resource for, as she says, talking about alternative funding models. So I would recommend following them, their website and their Twitter feed. And Tracy said, Danny makes a valuable point about how the system serves or doesn't serve artists and makers. It's a key question that comes up in conversation over here in Wales. Yeah, I mean, something that we've not really touched on, and maybe we don't have time, but throughout what DPE is sort of generating is this really nice transnational kind of conversation and community. And yeah, I guess some of the questions we've had is how much do these kind of problems or contexts kind of differ in different locations. So I think that's something we're going to probably reflect on after this. But yeah,
maybe can I add a very quick because I think I've been very abstract this whole talk, but I have more of a concrete answer maybe to some of the last questions. But I feel maybe what we've been seeing, I'm not an expert on this, but at least in the past few years, there's a shift to, like we really see that, you know, the previous economic models that's been taken for granted are a bit like, you know, cracking or breaking down. There's this new field of decentralized finance, decentralized, you know, organizations that were not, you know, as popular as they, you know, started to be in the past few years. And I think, like, my prediction at least is that this is going to really like change the rules of the game very soon. And there are many interesting experiments and projects going on. I mean, in a very like kind of still controversial space of like blockchain and decentralized, you know, autonomous organizations. But I have like, you know, group of people who are also like, you know, contributors to Weird Economies who are thinking about different models of art funding for performance art or circus art in Europe based on designing a blockchain application where essentially you find your own community that values your art. And this is what, you know, we've been talking about for ages in the art system. That's essentially the problem, that, you know, we have like a very standardized, you know, institutionalized kind of context for what is valued and what is not. So the idea is really to form like different communities of value. And that has to be kind of a decentralized effort, probably. So it's the question of what models would enable that. And I think like we already seeing like some of those tools at least starting to emerge.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Well, we've ran nearly 10 minutes over, so I'm going to end it there. But there's so much to things that was starting to come through then that I really definitely am going to follow up with some of you afterwards. And I think in the DPE kind of sessions and on the platform, we're going to sort of work on reflecting on some of these sessions and some of the concepts and the vocabulary that's being used, as well as some of the questions. So thank you so much, Laura and Bahar, for talking to us today about your practices, and really appreciate it. So thank you, and thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate it. And yeah, and do keep following. There's one last event in our symposium, as Alessandra mentioned, next Tuesday evening. It's Alistair Hudson, Tanya Bruguera and Suzanne Lacey in conversation, thinking about how to, again, I think more kind of reinstituting happening through artistic practice. So so that will be great. And yeah, thank you, and have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.